Okay, so welcome everyone. I'm Jenna Lacqua. I am Executive Director of the History Project, and it is my pleasure tonight to introduce you all to our panelists for our panel LGBTQ Migration and Immigration from the 1950s to Today. This panel has been in the works for a couple of months now, and I want to say in particular thank you to our volunteer Anna, who has been amazing in helping us to coordinate all of our speakers and put this session together. We appreciate you, Anna. Thank you so much for your work, and to our Events and Outreach Committee as well, who have also worked to promote and get information out about this event and all the events that we do here at the History Project. So I have one History Project plug before we start the panel. And tonight what I'll be doing is reading everyone's bios. Our panelists will speak and give a little presentation for an amount of time, and then we'll have a discussion and Q&A toward the end of the presentation. So that'll be that. But we here at the History Project, we're Boston's LGBTQ community archives. We document, preserve, and share LGBTQ history. And coming up next week, we're doing a Q&A and talk back after a screening of the new documentary Cured. So Cured spotlights a diverse group of activists who achieved an epic victory in the movement for LGBTQ equality. They fought to force the American Psychiatric Association to remove homosexuality from its manual of mental illnesses in 1973. So it's a really great documentary. We are screening it for free. And then next Thursday, we'll be in conversation with the documentary's directors and with Dr. Richard Pillard about his experience. So I hope to see you for that. And thanks to Mass Humanities Bridge Street Fund for its support of tonight's program and for next week's panel as well. I lied, I have one more plug. The History Project is able to do the work that we do because of the support of our community of viewers like you, as they say on PBS. And if you are interested in supporting our efforts, I will drop a link in the chat where you can donate and learn more about the work that we do. I'd like to also tonight point you to the efforts of the LGBT Asylum Task Force, which Al will be talking more about. We'll provide links in the chat if you'd like to learn more about their efforts and donate toward their cause as well. And thank you also to all of you who donated as part of your free RSVP tonight. We were able to raise almost $200 to be split between the History Project and the Asylum Task Force, which is pretty amazing. So thank you. All right, and now for our panelists. First, we will be hearing from Ethne Lobheld and Karma Chavez. Ethne is Professor of Gender and Women's Studies at the University of Arizona and former director of the Institute for LGBT Studies at University of Arizona. She's the author of Pregnant on Arrival, Making the Illegal Immigrant, and Entry Denied, Controlling Sexuality at the Border. She's also the co-editor with Karma Chavez of Queer and Trans Migrations, Dynamics of Illegalization, Detention, and Deportation. We'll also put a link in the chat to where you can pick up their book. Karma R. Chavez is a rhetorical critic who utilizes textual and field-based methods and studies the rhetorical practices of people marginalized within existing power structures. She's published numerous scholarly articles and books, including Queer Migration Politics, Activist Rhetoric and Coalitional Possibilities, as well as co-founding the Queer Migration Research Network. She works with social justice organizations, and her scholarship is informed by queer of color theory? Nope, I missed a line, I apologize, Karma. She works with social justice organizations, and her scholarship is informed by queer of color theory, women of color feminism, post-structuralism, and cultural studies. Chavez is currently associate professor and chair of the Department of Mexican American and Latino Studies at the University of Texas at Austin. Our next speaker will be attorney Richard Ian Doley. Richard has practiced U.S. immigration law since 1977. Throughout his career, Richard has served as a mentor for other attorneys through AILA and the Political Asylum Immigration Representation Project. He's also the author of numerous articles on U.S. immigration matters for AILA, MCLE, and others. Richard's current bar admissions include the Massachusetts Bar, the Federal District Court of Massachusetts, and the First Circuit Court of Appeals. He holds a bachelor's in philosophy from the College of the Holy Cross in Worcester and a Juris Doctor from Northeastern University School of Law in Boston. And then Al will round out our panel. Al Green is the ministry director of the LGBT Asylum Task Force. As a gay asylum seeker from Jamaica and a graduate of Worcester Polytechnic Institute, he has a unique perspective on the differences and similarities between the LGBTQ communities in both countries. He's also an avid swimmer and a lover of all things food. Thank you all for being here. And now I turn it over to Karma and Ethna.
Thank you so much, Joan, for your generous introduction, and thank you, Joan and Anna, for organizing tonight's event. We're very honored to be here, and we also want to thank everybody who's part of tonight's conversation. Karma and I are going to switch off back and tell you about this book, our edited collection, Queer and Trans Migrations, Dynamics of Illegalization, Detention, and Deportation. So Karma's just sharing a quick screen, and then we're going to, now that you've seen it, simply go back to being able to see one another and talk to one another. We wanted to tell you what prompted us to create the book, which has to do with the political and historical moment that we're in, and where scholarship and public discussions are at. We also wanted to talk about why we thought it was important to have academics, activists, and artists together in one book, and the kind of work that we hope that the book can inspire in the world. And we're especially pleased to be able to talk with an audience that has come together around the History Project, which is such an extraordinary resource for the history of New England's LGBTQ communities, which have always included LGBTQ migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers from all walks of life.
We decided to work on the book after we co-organized a conference on queer migration in 2014, which happened just before the so-called child migrant crisis that had happened that summer. We envisioned the book as a companion to Ethna's earlier co-edited volume, Queer Migration, Sexuality, U.S. Citizenship, and Border Crossing, which centered queer of color migrants and communities and questions of border crossing and citizenship. And I have a book that's called Queer Migration Politics, and it was also in print, and it was widely circulating at the time, as was a growing body of work in trans migration studies. So it seemed like the right moment to broaden queer and trans migration conversations to take up increasingly urgent issues of criminalization, detention, and deportation. And so we put out a call for papers for the book in 2017, as everyone was living with the dire effects of the newest rounds of shrinking public resources, expanding state strategies for criminalizing and locking people up, and in the US context, of course, the election of Donald Trump.
That was also a moment during which untold millions of people around the world continued being forced into migration because of global economic restructuring, displacement, war, and other conditions. And yet countries like the United States that play key roles in generating migration, including through trade and economic policies, invasion, warfare, and policies fueling the climate crisis, were not addressing their role in generating migration, but instead slamming the door, building walls, and criminalizing migrants. As a result of that, untold numbers of people who risked their safety and lives to cross borders were and still are unable to access legal status and live under conditions of marginalization, exploitation, and often fear. They remain ineligible for basic assistance or care and are vulnerable to separation from family and friends at any moment through detention and deportation. The United States has the largest immigrant detention system in the world, and the detained people are not just undocumented folks, but also long-term US legal residents and recent border crossers, including people planning to apply for asylum. They're held in a sprawling network of facilities, most of which are private for-profit detention centers, where the goal is to make money off imprisoning people, even while most do not meet even basic standards of care and safety. We know this because more than 2 decades of reports show that migrants in detention deal with constant intimidation, coercion, and abuse. They usually don't get adequate food. They don't get basic health care. They don't get easily get access to things like tampons or soap, which are increasingly, at this moment of the pandemic, that is a particularly urgent issue. Sexual coercion is rampant. Lawsuits have been filed against facilities because detainees work for $1 a day. Solitary confinement is routinely used against people, including folks who are suicidal or ill, and used to supposedly protect transgender women. And people have died under these conditions of neglect and violence. And reports have been coming out talking about the specific kinds of additional forms and harassment that LGBTQ folks in detention also face in addition to these general conditions.
These kinds of logics and practices stem from and legitimize forms of violence and dispossession that are directed toward US citizens, including the growth of mass incarceration that especially targets US citizens who are Black, Brown, Indigenous, poor, queer, trans, and female. Meanwhile, even while basic goods and services like food, shelter, healthcare, and education are rolled back, and people, migrant and citizen alike, are experiencing what anthropologist Elizabeth Povinelli calls economies of abandonment and dispossession. The pandemic has further deepened these dynamics and suffering.
And we notice that media and politicians, whether they're Republican or Democrat, tend to frame migrants and also marginalized US communities as somehow causing the kinds of crises that we're living through. The contributors in this book, however, flip the script. They call out the carceral nation state, corporations, and white supremacist, anti-Black, heterosexist, transphobic logics and practices as what is actually the crisis that needs to be transformed.
So the contributions to our book help us do several things. So one, I think they help us to analyze and understand the current structures of power that are creating these conditions of dispossession and suffering. They help us to make links among struggles so we can understand how the illegalization, detention, and deportation of queer and trans migrants connects with the movement for Black lives, with feminist politics, with queer and trans rights and prison abolition. The contributions make the connections among struggles at different scales, from the most local to the global. For nation state migration, detention, deportation, and security regimes draw from and cite one another to legitimate their actions, just like capitalism creates the scripts for countries and corporations alike to draw and exploit migrant labor and Black, Native, Brown, female, poor, queer, and trans labor, profiting at every step. Excuse me. Contributors to this book also document extraordinary histories of refusal, resistance, and dreaming and working toward a different world that is not just about surviving, but about thriving, starting not with rich white men, but with communities that have faced most harm under the current system. And they remind us that we all have a part to play in making change, which varies depending on your circumstances, but everything counts, everything matters, and every effort helps.
In the book, we use the terms queer and trans in a double sense. We use them both as identity categories and as analytic frameworks. As identity categories, we're aware that terms like queer and trans, just like lesbian, gay, bisexual, heterosexual, cisgender, transformista, loca, bakla, require us to navigate complicated political, ethical, and theoretical mandates. And this is because there really is nothing essential, universal, or timeless about these categories. Instead, they have emerged through and are still implicated in histories and geographies of power. And they're complicated because they involve both self-attribution by people or others attribute these terms to us. They are tied to and uphold state regimes for making people legible, including in the asylum process, and they offer compromised but important means for making claims and fashioning one's life. The essays in the book deal with these issues, which that was a whole lot of stuff, so we could talk about it in the Q&A if people would like to. But how the book deals with this is basically we honor people who self-identify as queer and trans migrants. We don't participate in conversations about who is, quote, really gay or not gay, lesbian, bisexual, queer, or trans, because we know migrants are constantly being policed about that, being told by immigration officials and community members that they don't fit the norms, and that this is painful and difficult. So the approach of the book is to honor people's self-identifications and to lift up the experiences, the vision, and the work by people who self-identify as LGBTQ people and migrant.
So the book as a whole uses a queer studies framework, and this is different from a lesbian and gay studies framework because it refuses the idea that sexual, gender, or other identities are essential or transhistorical, and instead explores how the distinctions between normal versus abnormal sexualities and genders get created, and the regimes of power and domination that are involved. A queer analysis makes clear that the processes for producing sexual and gender norms are completely tied up with dynamics of capitalism, colonialism, settler colonialism, racialization, and nation formation. Now, queer analysis also commonly uses a heteronormativity framework, which we also use. Heteronormativity, which is not the same as heterosexuality, suggests that all societies are structured around sexual and intimate norms that are not everywhere and always the same, but generally normalized and privileged sexuality channeled into childbearing within male-female marriage among the dominant ethnic, racial, and class group. That norm produces a range of subaltern groups, including lesbians, gay men, and trans people, and also poor and racialized women who birth children, sex workers, and others who do not match up to or adhere to sexual and intimate norms. Our book centers queer and trans identified migrants and organizations, but it is in conversation with migrant, queer, feminist, racial, and economic justice struggles of all sorts that are linked in struggles against heteronormativity.
The book also acknowledges and honors important changes that we have seen over the last 2 decades. And these include that queer and trans migrants are increasingly visible at the forefront of really extraordinary social movements, organizing efforts, and cultural work that has redefined how we understand and work for migrant and queer justice. In 2007, Queers for Economic Justice, which is no longer operational, unfortunately, released something called Queers and Immigration, a vision statement, which envisioned transforming the immigration system in ways that centered the priorities of queer and trans people and communities that are most harmed by the current policies. And since that date, numerous activist, artist, and artivist groups have emerged. And just to mention a few in the United States, these include the Trans-Latina Coalition, the Immigrant Justice Youth League, United We Dream, the Center for Cultural Power, the Queer Undocumented Immigrant Project, Mariposas Sin Fronteras, Familia Trans Queer Liberation, Trans Queer Pueblo, the Queer Detainee Empowerment Project, the Black LGBTQ Migrant Project, and many, many more. All these organizations have made huge inroads into checking and addressing the gender and sexual normativity of the immigrant rights movement, as well as demanding that queer movements address immigration issues and setting queer and trans migrant-centered agendas, challenging the treatment of trans and queer migrants in detention, and doing much more. And this kind of work in the United States is also visible globally with organizations like the Forcibly Displaced Peoples Network, the African LGBTQI+ Migrant Network, Rainbow Refugee, Queer Refugees Deutschland, and many other organizations.
Now, in creating the book, we didn't try to produce something that we claim is representative, which would be impossible anyway, but instead we issued an open call that invited grounded, cutting edge work that helps us understand the moment we're in and how to move forward in transformative ways. Queer and trans migrations remains heavy on contributions from and research about the United States. This troubling overrepresentation reflects US power and hegemony in the production and circulation of academic knowledge. The book is not intended to suggest, though, that US experiences are universal or generalizable, and contributors also engage processes of illegalization, detention, and deportation in places like Turkey, Greece, Canada, and Native nations.
The book came about because of the urgency of the current situation, the need to keep having conversations and taking action, and the importance of ensuring the work remains centered on gender, sexual, racial, economic, and geopolitical justice that begins with the priorities of those who have been most harmed by the current system. I'm certainly glad Donald Trump did not get a second term and that President Biden has begun taking action on immigration that will be helpful. And yet we also know Biden's agenda is hardly radical, and he is going to face an uphill battle to make changes. That suggests that the work must continue in these difficult times. And yet these are also times of unusual possibility. In these times, people have been coming together and demanding big changes that were not part of public conversation even a couple of years ago. And these include demands to abolish ICE, which is Immigration and Customs Enforcement, abolish detention, abolish the police, abolish mass incarceration that has severely harmed Black, brown, poor, queer, trans people, to let migrants stay, and to rebuild communities to ensure not just survival, but well-being for everybody by moving the money from these systems of detention and incarceration to invest in health, housing, food, education, and other resources that could benefit everybody. The book documents some of these histories and some of the tools that have helped to get us to this point. I think of it as a work of love and thanks, and as a call to keep going. All the royalties from the book are donated to support the work of the organization Mariposas Sin Fronteras, which has been doing this work for several decades now here in Tucson, where I'm based. And we're happy to answer questions about the book, but first we're honored to hear from Richard and Al about their extraordinary work with LGBTQ migrants in New England. Thank you.
Thank you. And all right, doing some behind the scenes zooming. All right, Richard, you are spotlighted, and let me share your presentation. And I just want to mention, folks, well, first of all, Ethna and Karma, thank you so much for your presentation and for sharing information about your book and your research. You put a link in the chat to the book. We'll recopy and add it again so that folks who popped in will be able to see that. And the History Project also put together a list of resources for folks, including some of the resources that you talked about. So we'll put a link to the list of resources in the chat as well, so folks can take a look at those. And now I turn it over to Richard Ian Doley.
Great, thank you very much. I'm unmuted, I hope. Yeah. So thanks very much to the project for hosting this, and particularly to Joan and Anna for doing the organizing, and to the my fellow panelists. I want to pick up on Ethna and Karma's description of sort of the current struggle and put it into a bit of a historical perspective. The most important thing, I think, is just to realize that we actually have had a lot of victories in the last 60 to 70 years. And I'm hoping that with that knowledge, it also fortifies us a bit to go forward for the struggles that are facing us right now and which will continue into the future. I strongly support Black Lives Matter, and I hope that within the LGBT community that we really stick up for our Black and brown and other people of color immigrants, and particularly for Black and brown trans women who have been subject to so much violence and are continually. I think the most significant thing in the last 70 years really is that people have come out. So I just say that, come out wherever you are. There are many, many organizations and groups which have struggled. There are allies like the American Psychiatric Association, American Medical Association, ACLU, et cetera. Lots of gay groups that have fought, many, many lawyers in different settings. My part is very minimal, so when I say we, I'm not referring to me much, but to the overall movement of struggle. But I think that by far the most significant thing is that people have come out and stood up for themselves, and that movement of telling our stories is what's caused the ground to shift under the political scene in the United States. So, next slide. So what I'd like to do is just summarize very quickly and then go into some detail in particular ones. The categories that the US Congress and the old Immigration Naturalization Service and now Department of Homeland Security have used in discriminating against LGBTQ people. First of all, there was an actual exclusion written into the 1952 Act by Congress that was not removed until 1990. And it said that gay people were not admissible to the United States, could not get visas, could not be allowed into the country, could not be granted permanent residence of status. And then the other thing is that we were accused of committing crimes in our expressions of affection and sexuality as crimes against nature. And criminal activity is one is used by the government to particularly separate foreign nationals from status in the US. Then there was the HIV positive and AIDS exclusion that happened from '87 to 2010 that was bad enough in itself as going after people with illness, but then particularly focused on gay men who are HIV positive, and I'll explain more about that. Then the Defense of Marriage Act, DOMA, which now seems like ancient history, but which barred any benefits arriving from, marriage equality or same-sex marriage and any federal benefits that arose from them. There were very restricted rights for transgendered persons. That changed quite dramatically at a certain point, but generally there was an absolute prohibition of recognizing any relationship between transgendered persons. Then naturalization, that is the gaining of US citizenship by lawful permanent residents, was denied because persons who were gay, who were practicing homosexuals, were persons inherently of bad moral character. And that you also have to have gained lawful permanent residence lawfully. And if you had denied that you were gay to get into the country, then you didn't have lawful permanent residence. And then finally, asylum was denied because it was available to particular social groups, but the LGBT community was not recognized as a social group for any purpose. And it also was available only if you had an immutable characteristic that was subject of persecution. And since we were supposedly able to change our sexuality, we didn't have an immutable characteristic, and therefore we were denied asylum. So next slide. So what they did was they created grounds of exclusion. You had to fit into a category to get into the country. You had to be the spouse of a US citizen, a permanent resident, or the child or the parent, or come in for particular purposes like studying in the United States or working, teaching, etc. And even if you fit into one of the categories, they then had this grid of exclusionary categories, which would nevertheless still prevent you from gaining status. And the 1952 Act declared that gay people were persons of psychopathic personality. And that was used in the health category. Later on, HIV exclusion was also added using the health basis. Then criminal ones, as I mentioned, crimes against nature, prior immigration violations, they would challenge people who had been admitted who knew they were gay when they were admitted, but who had denied it or had not acknowledged it, or didn't realize that being gay was being a person of psychopathic personality, and therefore answered honestly, but didn't recognize the definition of the law. These three categories were used extensively to block gay people and were largely unknown within the general public. There's also grounds to remove people, or what used to be called deportation. They're not exactly parallel, but they're similar. And so a lot of people who are here who thought they were safe would then be deported for violations of these same types of categories. So Congress passed the act in an amendment to the Immigration Nationality Act in '52, excluding foreign persons of psychopathic personality. It's sort of similar to what the religious people around the world, and particularly Christians, say of that we are intrinsically disordered or sinful or perverted. This was supposedly a scientific medical term that would be used, and it was challenged in a number of settings, and it finally was upheld as constitutional by the US Supreme Court in '67. That court was considered one of the most liberal, if not the most liberal, Supreme Courts in the history of the United States. So even with a very liberal Supreme Court, we made no progress. And this again was just 2 years before Stonewall. Now, Stonewall happens, and it's really a revolution takes place. People start coming out and challenging, and the American Medical Association and the American Psychiatric Association finally said that they would refuse to certify persons who were gay as suffering from a gay psychopathology. I believe that actually came out as a formal ruling in the Handbook on Mental Diseases in 1973. It was interesting that because this was listed as a health concern, in order to exclude someone or to deport them, they had to get a certificate from a practicing doctor who said that the person suffered from what they called a Class A defect, and psychopathic personality was a Class A defect. So when the medical profession said, hey, doctors should not sign these certificates because it's not based on science, it's not good medicine, it left the government without the certificates they needed to present to the judges to exclude and or to deport people. And so there was then a battle. There was in California, there was a case of a guy who came in with a pink triangle on his suitcase, and he was interrogated extensively by the immigration officers at the airport in San Francisco and put into removal proceedings. And the courts in that area finally said, no, you have to have the medical certificate. Without that, you can't deport the person. And then in Texas, in a case called the matter of Longfellow, there was a person who had been in the United States for almost 30 years. He applied for citizenship, and it came out that he was gay. And so they moved to take away his citizenship because he was inherently a person of bad moral character. And then they moved to deport him because he was a person of psychopathic personality. But again, the doctors refused to give a certificate. And the courts there in Texas, in the, I think it's the Fifth Circuit, ruled that even without the certificate, if there was other reliable evidence, they could still deport the person. So this person, after being in the US 30 years, lost his citizenship, lost his green card, and was deported. The struggle continued. And again, I think the ground of, the political social ground in the United States changed so much that in 1990, Congress removed the gay exclusion, and we no longer had to worry about hiding or denying or misunderstanding the challenge that we were persons of psychopathic personality. So AIDS hits, and Congress passes a law in '86 for an amnesty, which is similar to what we're talking about now with comprehensive immigration reform. And there were a number of, they estimated there were going to be 10 million people, but there really were about 2.5 million people who applied under the amnesty. And Reagan issued an executive order banning people who are HIV positive from the United States. So it was an HIV positive AIDS exclusion. The Secretary of Health and the Surgeon General and the CDC all said that AIDS was not a disease that was contagious, and therefore it shouldn't be barred under a dangerous contagious disease definition. But they went against the recommendation of their medical people and instituted the exclusion. However, they did allow a humanitarian waiver of the exclusion. In other words, you had to take a medical test with a blood exam. That was then provided showing that you were HIV positive. You were then going to be denied status or denied entry or denied permanent residence. But there was a humanitarian waiver, and we won most of those cases on humanitarian grounds. Clinton becomes president and he decides that he's going to remove the executive order, withdraw it. And Congress then says, well, if you do that, we will codify it in the law. We will enact legislation to put it into the Immigration and Nationality Act. So he backed off and said that he would not issue the executive order or withdraw the Reagan and Bush one. And Congress nevertheless went ahead and added the exclusion to the Immigration and Nationality Act. But what was particularly vile was they took away the humanitarian waiver. So the only humanitarian aspect of this awful exclusion was gone. And in its place, they set up a requirement that in order to get the waiver, you had to have what was called an anchor relative. And the anchor relative was the spouse, parent, or unmarried son or daughter of a US citizen or a permanent resident. Well, we weren't allowed to get married at the time, so we didn't have spouses. Adoption was not widespread, and most of us wouldn't have had children naturally anyways. Some, but most wouldn't have. So we wouldn't have had the son or daughter, and most were adults and their parents were in home countries. So the ability to get past the HIV exclusion was eliminated really virtually across the board, and it threw tens of thousands of HIV positive foreign nationals into hiding. If they left, they might go to a country where they couldn't get any treatment at all, and there wasn't much available for many years. If they left, they would be exiled from their partner. They might be in a political situation where the treatment of HIV positive people, again, most of whom at the time were gay men, would have been subject to tremendous homophobia and violence. So the situation was really very dire, and we had to counsel people to try to find other ways to stay here and to protect themselves, which was very, very difficult. So in July 2008, Congress eliminated the HIV ground of exclusion. And the Department of Health and Human Services found that it really was not a dangerous communicable disease of public health significance. And then Health and Human Service finally proposed a rule eliminating it altogether. So all those people who had been eligible to move forward could now move forward based on a humanitarian waiver again, and not have to, or not even need the waiver once the rule effectively eliminated the ground of exclusion. What was interesting is this was Bush's son, who was actually quite good on HIV, and he moved and Senator Kerry. They were the two real moving forces to get this done in a battle that lasted about 10 or 11 years. So then the next huge change, and obviously it's something where we have today and can celebrate, not that it's the solution for everybody or for all identities, but the Defense of Marriage Act made it impossible to be married in a marriage equality or same-sex marriage, and therefore all of the federal benefits that came from that, and there really are hundreds, were denied binational or marriages, that is where someone is an American and someone is a foreign national. GLAAD, the local gay and lesbian activist organization here, which has done great work for 40 years, won the first big victory in Goodrich versus Department of Public Health. And the Supreme Judicial Court in Massachusetts found that it was unconstitutional to deny marriage rights to same-sex couples. So that became effective in 2004, and literally thousands of people were married from all over the country coming to Massachusetts at that time. But there was a 10-year delay before there was a challenge in federal court, and the case of United States versus Windsor was one coming out of the New York District Court and then to the Second Circuit Court of Appeals and then to the US Supreme Court. And Section 3 of DOMA was declared unconstitutional, saying that federal benefits, in this case it was actually inheritance rights and tax benefits, could not be denied to people who were married in marriage equality marriages. And then finally in 2015, the Oberfeld case was one in which the 5-4 majority said that marriage of same-sex couples is a fundamental constitutional right. And then this opened up the possibility of having marriages of binational couples provide a category for residents in the United States, so that if I marry someone from another country, I can sponsor them just as I could if I sponsored a wife, and he will be able to get permanent residence and then ultimately US citizenship. So from that flowed the ability of all these couples who had been living underground for 30 or 40 years to come out and to gain status, gain protection, gain health insurance and retirement, to be able to travel outside the US to visit their homes and families for the first time in many years. So it was and is a major victory. And then naturalization. For naturalization, there were two major issues. One is you had to be a lawful permanent resident to be naturalized. Usually you had to be a resident for 3 to 5 years, have your green card for 3 to 5 years before you could become a citizen. But you also, in that process, had to show that for a certain period of time, you could not have been a person of bad moral character. And a number of federal district courts and even some circuits, I don't think it ever got to the US Supreme Court, found that practicing homosexuals were persons of bad moral character. So if you admitted that, then that was going to be used as a way of denying the citizenship. You also had to have been a lawful permanent resident. So if you entered the United States knowing that you were gay and said that you were not a person of psychopathic personality, and you knew that that meant that you were gay, then you had committed fraud or misrepresentation. And then the fraud and misrepresentation could be used to say that even if you weren't a practicing homosexual, you were gay but not practicing, I hate the term, that you were nevertheless denied naturalization because you weren't here lawfully as a permanent resident. So I'll tell you a story quickly. I represented a woman who entered as a refugee from the Soviet Union. But when she entered, she was only 10 years old. So they couldn't use the idea against her that she had lied about her sexuality because she didn't even know what it was when she was 10. So that was out. So we went into immigration and we wrote in red ink along the margins of the application, I am a practicing lesbian. And when we had the interview, the officer asked there's hundreds of questions that they go through on these forms, and never said anything about her being a lesbian. And so I said, I want to, and she said, the officer said, I'm going to recommend her for approval. And I said, but you can't do that. She's a practicing lesbian. We were hoping for a denial, because if we got a denial, we were going to take it up on appeal. And we were going to try to then have the Circuit Court of Appeals in the First Circuit in Massachusetts find that the denial was really unconstitutional. So we were trying to set it up for a court challenge. So the officer looked at me and she said, well, I don't think she is a person of bad moral character. Bravo. So I said, snarky as I am, I said, well, I'm sorry, I appreciate your position, but I'm going to take this up with the district director for Massachusetts on New England. And I think that by law, because the federal district court in Rhode Island had just issued a decision only months before saying that practicing lesbians are persons of bad moral character, that you have to, as a matter of law. And she said, well, I'm not going to. And I said, well, I'm going to go over your head to your boss. So I went to the two bosses and they never responded, and the client was naturalized. She was sworn in. I think, again, we won because the ground had switched. Even though a judge, one or two judges, we're still going that way. That even within the Immigration Service, there was a change in which the standards, the applicability of the law were such that they were not going to make findings that gay people, LGBTQ people were persons of bad moral character. So we didn't even have to go up. We already had won and we didn't know it. And there was no need to go into the federal court. And the last slide. Oh, second to last. So transgender persons were not recognized for many, many years. We would try to bring cases where one person identified, at that time they would say as male and the other as female, and say that therefore they should be treated under immigration law as man and woman. And they wouldn't recognize it. These decisions were before the marriage decision came. And when that came, it eliminated all these problems. But in Lovo Lara, the Board of Immigration Appeals basically said, if one person was post-op transgendered, that would mean that that person would no longer be treated as if he were a man. He would now be a woman, and therefore there was no same-sex relationship. It was really awful, but we could use it with some couples to win those cases. Again, the immigration started changing on their own and not requiring that someone have wanted to or intended to or have been post-op, that it really wasn't a part of the identity. It shouldn't have been required at all. When Oberfell came, we didn't have the issue at all. It was gone. But for transgender people right now, and particularly an awful lot of transgender women coming from Central America who are pushed into sex worker roles, the convictions that they face because of that, where they're driven, has then been used on the criminal grounds as a way of saying that there were these crimes against nature, and their convictions for illicit sexual activity can be used to not deny status. So that's also one of the frontiers that we're facing in terms of change that needs to come. And then the last is, I'll end with this, and then we can hear in some good detail from Al about people who are actually going through the asylum process now. Up until this 1994 decision by the Attorney General, immigration would take the position that being gay or LGBTQ was not being a member of a particular social group. And so we couldn't win because we couldn't show that the group was a group that was worthy of protection, that it was a group at all or worthy of protection. They would say that it was criminal activity and criminal status. It was not the identity of the individual that was being attacked. Hate the sin, not the sinner type thing. But what it meant was the sinner, or the gay person, was in fact then ineligible for asylum. They would also turn around and say that that you should give up being gay. It's not immutable. You can change. If you're stubborn and you don't want to change, you're not going to get protection. And so this decision by the Attorney General, who was Janet Reno, who all of us at least thought was a lesbian, and I hope she was, she issued a binding decision for the Immigration Service and for all the immigration courts. She had the authority as the Attorney General to order the Board of Immigration Appeals to make this a binding decision. And that opened up then the possibility that we could apply for asylum. Denial rates for asylum were still enormously high. And there was some great work by people out of Harvard Law School following the decisions of the judges in Boston, and showed that the denial rate was over 90% of asylum applications. So there was also a battle to get broader approval rates from the Immigration Service and from the immigration judges, which has happened in part. I mean, it's gone from about 90-some% denial to 70-some%. But at least there was a movement in the right direction. So the battle is to make asylum more available, but now it is available for LGBTQ people. So a hopeful message in the face of our continuing struggles. And I hope now Al can bring us up to date on some success in the work he does.
Thank you, Richard. And, oh, Al, okay, there you are, Al. Okay, Al, you're spotlighted and you should be able to share your screen.
I can. Awesome. So thank you, Richard. Thank you, Joan and Anna. Thank you, everyone, for taking the time out this evening to listen to us chat and to share some information about what we do. So as Joan had said at the start, my name is Al Green. I'm the Ministry Director of the Lgbtsm Task Force. And I'm going to do a presentation just talking a bit about it's not allowing me to, yeah, just talking a bit about the task force and what it is that we do, and then also talk a little bit about what the asylum process currently entails and what folks are facing. So the task force is a ministry of the Highland Park Congregational Church, UCC. We're based in Worcester, Massachusetts. Our church became what's known as ONA, Open and Affirming, which means that we are not just accepting of, but fully celebrating LGBTQ individuals. Church did that in 2004. In 2008, a gay asylum seeker from Jamaica, Linford Cunningham, is pictured here on the right, was referred to our church by his attorney. He was homeless, he was hungry, and he had serious doubts as to whether God loved him as a gay man. And as a result, he was having difficulties focusing and preparing for his asylum petition. And so his attorney remembered that our pastor, Judy Hanlon, had been pretty vocal throughout the state's marriage equality fight, and referred him to our church, where he was able to be connected to housing. He found a strong community here, and we provided food, a cell phone, so he could be in touch with folks. And we did all of that throughout the period until he could legally work to support himself. It was a huge learning process, as Richard touched upon. There's a lot that is entailed within asylum, and a lot of changes that have happened over the years, as possibly is the case with many of you on here this evening. There are parts of it that we certainly aren't aware of or weren't aware of, and so it was a huge learning process. We, like I said, we provided housing, food, a cell phone. We provide a monthly stipend. We have monthly workshops that are geared towards topics in the areas of self-sufficiency. So imagine being a newcomer to this country, right? You might have been pretty successful or a competent human being in your home country, but coming to the US, the systems and the processes might be very different. And so learning all of the ways and assimilating to life here in the US, we have workshops on all of those. So from finding a job to finding housing to knowing what your rights are as asylum seekers or as immigrants, to knowing what your rental rights are, to getting connected to other entities that are providing support services in the area of healthcare. And so it's a one-stop shop, so to speak, that we run. And then we also have group activities so that folks are able to find some sense of community and some sense of quote unquote normalcy as they're going through the pretty lengthy asylum process. We also provide connection to existing social and legal services within the state. And so we get folks connected to healthcare. We work pretty well with the Family Health Center in Worcester, the Kennedy Health Center also in Worcester, AIDS Project Worcester, folks who need services there. And then we also connect folks to pro bono attorneys for help with submitting their asylum petitions. It's just the organizational structure. We're fully under the church, and we have a bunch of subcommittees there where we have not just folks from our church, but also folks from within the wider community, secular or otherwise, or people of different faiths, traditions, who are able to participate and to help to make this work. Since 2008, we've directly supported about 400 people from over 20 of the 70 or so countries where it is currently illegal to be LGBTQ. And when I say illegal, we're talking about punishment ranging from imprisonment and capital punishment to being attacked by mobs, right? So it might not necessarily be illegal based on the legal system, but culturally, it's not supported. So there are many people who will get in touch with us on a regular basis trying to access services here. As you might imagine, an entity that is providing all of these comprehensive support services actually for the whole duration that it's needed, right? So once we decide that we're going to support someone, we will do that up until 3 months after that individual has received their work permit. And so committing to provide all of those support services as opposed to other entities that might just provide connections to attorneys, or they might just provide access to a food pantry once a month or maybe once a week, or you might have access to a shelter that you have to vacate during the daytime, or you're able to stay for maybe a few weeks or a month or so at a time. That's not what we do. We say we're going to get you connected to all the services that you need, provide stable and reliable housing for the whole duration until you no longer have that need, or until you're legally able to work and get a job and support yourself. The makeup of the folks who we have supported annually, you're looking at about 70% being cis male, 25% female, about 5% trans or non-binary folks. About half of the folks have some college education. About 40% have graduated high school otherwise, and about another 10% or so who weren't able to complete high school. Now, that makeup really is as a result of a bunch of barriers. One of the primary ones is earning potential, right? And so just as is the case here in the US, women and trans folks tend to, or cis females and trans folks tend to on average earn less than their cis male counterparts. And so they aren't necessarily able to afford the application fees to get a visa to be able to get to the US, or aren't able to afford the cost of airfare to get here to the US as well. Another barrier is not having enough country ties. And so when you go to apply for a visa, one of the questions that they ask is what are your ties to your home country? Because they want to make sure that you're going to return to your home country. So that would that be certain type of job, certain amount of income, savings, owning property, having family ties, right? And so a lot of folks aren't necessarily able to to meet that criteria to be able to even take that first step in getting a visa to get here. And then, of course, many women are raped because mistakenly, some people think that showing a woman how it is that they should have sex will somehow change them from being lesbian. And so they have children in their home countries that they don't necessarily want to leave, or have no one to leave them with, and so are forced to stay. And so that there are a lot of contributing factors to the makeup of the folks that we generally that are generally approaching us for support. So it's the asylum process is pretty lengthy, right? You have folks who have arrived in the U.S., right, have applied for asylum, and 5, 6, 7+ years later still have not had an asylum interview, and are still waiting. It is, yeah, it's just it's a frustrating process. And what I tell asylum seekers when they come is, don't just be prepared to wait, right? I mean, there are likely to be delays in the process, and the path for two people isn't necessarily going to be the same, right? You're going to have some people who will go through from start to getting their asylum granted within the course of maybe a year and a half or so. And then you have some folks who, like I mentioned before, 5, 6, 7+ years have had to wait to get to that point. After arriving in the US, folks are required to apply for asylum within a year. For us, for our process, we say you need to start the process. So whether that be going out and trying to find an attorney, or making those steps, we just want folks to get that process started, because that determines how soon it is that we can accept a new person to take their spot at the end. And so folks who apply for asylum, rarely is it towards the lower end of 21 days. It's most likely months or upwards of a year before an asylum seeker gets their asylum interview. They say they receive asylum. A year after that, paying $1,225, they can apply for their green card. And then 4 years after that, paying another $725, they can apply for citizenship. The folks receive asylum. To get their work permit, the first one, they have to pay $85 for a biometrics fee. If they're renewing, which is generally every 2 years or so, it's $495 for that additional fee. If someone applies for asylum and 365 days have passed and they haven't had their asylum interviews, they can then apply for their work permit, which generally comes in within 1 to 2 months. But we've seen it during the pandemic take over a year after applying for their work permits before they receive them. And then 3 months after that, that's when they would technically roll out of our program and create space for another asylum seeker to enter. And then at that point, the barriers to being able to be free and to be productive and to live life in the US continue, right? Folks still, as we know, right, even though we're living in Massachusetts, which kind of is a bubble compared to the rest of this country, even here still we have homophobia and transphobia that folks have to face. There are a lot of anti-immigrant misperceptions that are pervasive in the community. And then trying to access housing, right? Newcomers to the country won't necessarily have the enough credit history for landlords to run their, or might have social security numbers as yet for landlords to run their background checks. They might not have sufficient housing history because, of course, they're new to the country. And then when it comes to work, folks necessarily have sufficient work history here in the US, which some employers require, even though it's not necessary. I mean, if you're able to do the job in another country, and the tasks are the same or similar, you'd think that you'd be able to do it here. And the same goes with your training. So folks might have their degrees or their certifications in their home countries, but they aren't necessarily accepted by a lot of employers here. And so trying to navigate that, those barriers is difficult for individuals. Sometimes folks end up having to start at the bottom and go through, enter other fields that have lower barriers to entry than the fields that they're actually trained in. And then I'd say that you're able to go through all of that, and you do land a job, getting access to getting to work might not necessarily be easy, right? Folks might not necessarily have enough savings or have any savings at all to be able to purchase a car, which is needed in a lot of Massachusetts to get to work. And then when you talk about inadequate public transit in their cities and towns as well, that contributes to the barriers that prohibit you from accepting certain jobs and getting to work. So it costs about $40,000 per month for us to support anywhere from 24 to 30 or so, which is what we're at right now, 30 asylum seekers. It's a pretty hefty nut that we try to crack, and so we rely a lot on the community to help us to fundraise, and we write grants, and we have an annual fundraiser that we use to help to raise about a third of that. We're currently renovating a house that we were able to purchase this past fall in Worcester to house folks. We've been, since 2008, been renting apartment units in Worcester, 3 and 4 bedroom apartments where that are housed with asylum seekers who are LGBTQ asylum seekers who are in our program. And as you might imagine, that's pretty costly. And so we embarked on a multi-year capital raising campaign to be able to purchase it. And we're hoping by late spring, early summer to be able to move into that. At a high point, we had folks in 9 or 10 different locations throughout Worcester, and so that created, as you might imagine, an administrative nightmare. So this certainly being able to bring more of our folks under one roof certainly opens up a lot of possibilities for us. And then, like I mentioned before, we have our annual gala fundraiser. It's going to be virtual this year, September 25th. You can definitely go on our website, lgbtsm.org, to find out more information about that. But that is where we were able to fundraise about a third of our annual expenses. And so we certainly try to get as many folks to support that as possible. We usually do it in person, but last year and this year, of course, because of COVID, we've had to go virtual. Certainly invite folks. Hopefully we'll be able to resume this in the fall, depending on how the situation is. But we normally have a monthly community dinner every second Monday of the month at the church in Worcester. There you'll have on average 80 to 90 people in attendance. So there are asylum seekers who are currently receiving support, asylum seekers who've already transitioned out of our support, as well as members of the community who just want to interact and learn how it is that they can help individual folks, and just to learn more about what it is that we're doing. Invite folks to sign up for a mailing list on our website, and certainly spread the word on social media and within your various networks. Like I said before, we try to raise $40,000 per month to be able to do this, and so we rely on quite literally thousands of people to come together to do this. And so if you're interested in hosting a fundraiser, any idea, whatever it is, a few hundred to a few $1,000s, we will gladly accept and support all of those. And so that, in a nutshell, is the task force and the makeup of the folks that we're supporting.
Thank you so much, Al, for sharing all of that. I just put back into the chat links to Ethna and Karma's book, to the task force, to the history project, and to the social, legal, and health services for LGBTQ plus immigrants sort of resource document list that we put together. So yeah, we have about 20 minutes for conversation and questions. And I know I have a few, and a couple history project people have a few questions. But if you in the audience have a question and you would like to ask our panelists, please feel free to use the hand raise reaction, or if you're on camera and you want to wave, I can make sure that you're unmuted and we can just sort of get right into the discussion. And actually, first of all, do our panelists have any questions for each other? Not to put you on the spot. No one's jumping out yet. So I was wondering, Al, actually, if you could talk about some of the how COVID has complicated the work that you're already doing in the last year. If it, I say if it has complicated, like it hasn't complicated all of our lives, but like, you know, were you able to keep doing what you're doing despite the global pandemic?
Yeah, so it's been a pretty mixed year for us, right? As you might imagine, as is probably the case with many folks on here, right? Folks lost their jobs and weren't necessarily able to contribute financially in the way that they used to be able to do. And so we definitely lost a few donors, but remarkably, those who were able to contribute or continue to contribute actually increase their contributions to make up that shortfall. I guess it might just be the spirit of this past year where folks are extremely dialed in on social justice issues, and we tick many boxes. And so that possibly was it, but we're certainly grateful that folks who were able to do that did. We certainly had to it's been a pretty difficult year in the sense of just administering the administration of it all, right? So we normally rely on folks transitioning out of our support or housing so that we can accept new folks in. But because there was a delay in the issuing of work permits, right, for over a year, right, we weren't able to have the usual rolling off of folks. And so we actually had a backlog, so to speak, because folks were still trying to access services. So we actually, and we still are currently over our usual capacity. So we had to be pretty creative in finding housing and space for new folks. And then incoming folks, we've had to quarantine them in hotels. And so that was an additional expense. And so even though we did see a slight increase in donations, that was that all went to having to house folks and quarantine folks, incoming folks, prior to having them move into our usual housing and getting tested and moving into our usual housing. And so it's certainly been a very interesting year for us. Lots of changes, and certainly just like everyone else on here, hopefully we can start to roll back some of those in the coming months.
Thank you. And you mentioned the September 25th fundraiser, which I already have on my calendar now. Awesome. And then, like I said to folks in the audience, we put the link to the Asylum Project in the chat so that you can go and check out what they do and support them in this really essential and life-saving work that you're doing out there in Worcester. So yeah, do anyone have any questions or comments? Oh, there we go. We have one in the chat from Anna. And Anna says, thank you all for your truly empowering presentations. What are currently most needed effective ways to contribute to supporting queer immigrant communities?
Well, I'm happy to start what is a conversation for all of us. So thank you, Anna, for the question. And really what I wanted to say is everything helps, everything counts, whatever you can do is important. And some of how I think about it is for, just help directly to communities, stuff like food, very concrete needs that are urgent. And then the other aspect is there are lots of campaigns going on seeking to change the system, to make things work better, to abolish things like detention, to open up possibilities for getting asylum and refugee status. So if you see those campaigns to, add your name, call your representative if you have one. So work all those different aspects of the system are some of the things I'm thinking about, but I know everybody else also has other things they probably want to add to this.
Yeah, and just to add to what Ethna said, certainly talking to your representatives, you will want to support, talking to your representatives about the various barriers that might be existing towards folks being able to access public transit, for example, right, which a lot of immigrants use because of the, like what I mentioned, the barriers to get in a car and owning a car and the expenses that are associated with upkeep and all of that. And certainly when you hear anti-queer or anti-immigrant sentiments being said, speak up, right? I mean, I know that challenging people certainly can be uncomfortable to do, but that is the way in which you change stuff, right? I mean, even if it is that you don't necessarily change an individual's mind, at least they'll think twice before expressing those sentiments in public.
Thank you.
Can I just add with also funds? I mean, people have a lot of need. Funds are also coming in for very locally, right? So I do live in Tucson. So as Tucson gets money and programs are begun to make the vaccine available, to make food available, to just keep asking, are you sure those are accessible for immigrants and refugees of all statuses and for LGBTQ communities? Because often folks aren't thinking that, but if you ask the question, they will rethink how to make sure that everybody can access the resources that are coming in.
Thank you so much.
I would add just what I began with, which is if you are LGBTQ, come out as best you can when it's safe, when you feel you can do it. I think that also spreads the humanity in such a way that people are moved. In Massachusetts right now, there's legislation pending in the House and the Senate to allow non-documented persons to get driver's licenses, which has been a huge problem. And the governor has been opposed to it, so it hasn't moved, but there's growing support for that. So if you want to speak to your legislators about the driver's license issue, that's big. There's legislation in Washington in the House to grant permanent residence and a path to citizenship for people, the DACA people, the dreamers, the people who were brought here as children, and also for people who are under TPS, temporary protected status, from around 14 different countries where there were wars or natural disasters, earthquakes, hurricanes, floods, etc. And those people together, both the DACA people and the TPS people, are probably around 1.5 million. So there's an effort to get them legal status and a path towards citizenship. So if you want to support that, that would also be very, very helpful. And ultimately, we need comprehensive immigration reform, which I think the Republicans are going to do everything they can to block. But it's something that really would affect what they say are 8 to 10 million people who are here without status and who are stuck, and almost all of whom are working. They keep the Social Security fund alive. They don't get the benefits, but they contribute to it. If we lost 8 million workers, we would have a major recession again. So all the ideas from the Republicans of deport them, deport them, deport them are just pure foolishness. That's not going to happen either. So there ought to be an effort to reform the system. So if you're in favor of that, I would say be in touch with your representatives, your federal representatives also.
And can I just add briefly on that one? Sorry, folks, but you're all getting me going, right? So what Richard said, like, yes, there are proposals, and some of the helpful conversations I've been hearing from groups are definitely, you know, anything that can be done for any group, stand up for it and challenge, if possible, the tendency to say, well, we will give status to folks with DACA or TPS, but in return, you better agree to, we get like $1 billion more for border enforcement. No, de-link those. We don't have to agree to that. That money should be going to other stuff. Just to highlight that we can push back when they try to bring together these proposals and simply focus really on agendas for well-being and thriving for groups that are being put forward.
Thank you. And thank you all for your answers. We have another question from Christina in the chat. And Christina says, thank you all. The obstacles are so intimidating for immigration. If a person feels they cannot wait in the US, what are their options for returning to their home countries if they wanted to, or are they stuck in some kind of limbo?
Well, that's going to depend to a great extent who they are and where they come from. Obviously, if they come from a country that persecutes LGBTQ people or permits it or doesn't protect them, then they're not going to want to go back there. There are possibilities of applying for asylum in other countries, but they've tried to make that very restrictive too. So, for instance, if you apply in the United States, generally you can't apply in Canada. So the possibility of going to a third country is much more complicated than it might seem. If a person is here and out of status over a certain period of time, in most cases when they leave, they're not allowed to come back from, depending on how long they've been here, for 3 to 10 years. So they need to think through whether they simply want to go home for a visit and to, you know, to mend their hearts after having been separated. They could walk into a much more difficult problem of not being able to get back, even if some other path opens up. So the way the immigration system works is they're almost always happy to see you leave, so they won't prevent you from leaving. The question is this the best place for you, and can you make it better? If you leave, is it going to be better or worse? And how can you manage that or control that? And that should be thought out very carefully with counselors and friends and people you trust.
Thank you, Richard.
Just one thing quickly. What Ethna said was really important. You know, for years we've opposed the idea of separating the immigration reform into pieces. The Republicans always said, oh, there's a lot of things we'll get behind and support, which I think are just outright lies. And so if you just did those pieces, we'll support them and get them through. Then once they talk about doing it separately, they let you know that they're going to oppose that also. So there is a political battle about even, for instance, having DACA and TPS done as a separate bill, because if they ultimately did give status to them, then they'll turn around and say, well, the other people don't deserve it. These people did, but the rest don't. So there is a political gamble about separating and trying to get some benefits through for some people, and thereby really stymieing the efforts to help the vast majority. And it's confused the situation for 15 years or more. Right now, this administration feels like they would like to at least to try to get something through, or even make the Republicans show their hands that even though they claim they're going to do it, they won't, and that therefore the political responsibility lies with them and not with the Democrats. And obviously the Democrats are not totally in favor of a lot of these things either. So it really needs people to pressure delegations from states where they're either opposed or wishy-washy, even if they're Democrats.
Can I jump in on that real quick just to say, one of the things that I think is really important that all of us can do, and this speaks to really one of Richard's points, is not participate in talking about good versus bad immigrants or people who are worthy versus unworthy, just in the way we talk. And so that participates in criminalizing people and ensuring that some people who have needs aren't going to get them met because they're part of this dichotomy. And so I think that's a little thing that we can all do. Even if you don't have money to give, you don't have time, you can intervene in that kind of good versus bad immigrant dichotomy and you know, insist that all people deserve their human rights.
Good point.
Thank you, Karma, and thank you, Richard. So it's 8:27. I want to get people out of here around 8:30 because it's still a school night here in Massachusetts. So if anyone has a final question or comment, there's been, I don't know if presenters are seeing this, there's been so many thank yous in the chat for participating in this tonight and for sharing your stories and for sharing information about what you're working on and your causes. Oh, and there's another, okay, Kevin has a question. And Kevin says, thank you all. Kevin says, oh, no, it's a comment. This has inspired me to continue fighting for immigrant rights, such as Family and Mobility Act, driver's license bill at the Massachusetts legislature. Thank you, Kevin, for mentioning that. And I think Richard mentioned it too, that battle is happening locally here in Massachusetts, for those of you who are tuning in from Massachusetts. We have some more thank yous. Does anyone on the panel have any final thoughts for us tonight, or anything else that they'd like to share with the audience before we stop?
I want to thank everybody for tuning in. It's great to see these numbers of interested people. And again, thank you to the History Project for the work you've done for all these many years. The archives are fabulous and a lot of your programs are really excellent. So thank you for being there for us.
Well, thank you. And yeah, Ethna, did you have a comment?
I would just second everything that Richard said. Like, thank you so much to this audience. Your presence and anything you do is extremely important. Thanks to the panelists. It was really just wonderful to be in this conversation. Thank you, Joan, Anna, and the History Project for organizing that we could actually be here and talk about this. It's a really important and encouraging opportunity. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you and Karma. And I know I'm going to go pick up the book. We'll share on the link to the book again. I'll send a follow-up email to everyone who registered with all of the links we've been sharing and information about everything, so that if there's anything you want to go back to or learn more about, you'll have that right there in your inbox. And so I'd just like to say thank you to Ethna and Karma and Richard and Al for taking the time to talk to us all tonight. And again, thank you to everyone in the audience. Please check out those links. Keep up with what we're all doing in this fight for each other. And I hope to see you at a History Project event sometime soon in the future, maybe even next week at our documentary panel discussion at 7 p.m. with the directors of Cured and Dr. Richard Pillard. And at events coming up, I mean, suddenly it's Pride season, everyone, if we're gliding into June at this point. So yeah, I think that's everything from me. Any final words, anyone?
I want to say,
Oh, good.
sorry. Yeah, just want to say thank you as well. And certainly to everyone, just a charge to just get involved, right? Find a cause, whether it be around immigration or queer issues, just whatever it is that's happening in your community. Just do something. Whatever you can do, just do something.
Thank you. And thank you for your work. And with that, we're going to stop the recording.